welcome back to Section 10, Part 2. I know I messed the whole coin thing up. I got thinking about that. I'm not going to redo it. I think we said Grant won it, and then I said Lee was going to do first, so we're going to do Robert E. Lee. I've got my little Confederate hat on. I've got my Confederate outfit on that's wool, and I'm sitting out here in 80 degrees. So anyway, so let's start about Robert E. Lee. First of all, guys, Robert E. Lee, the United States has produced three great military geniuses. Winfield Scott. Remember, Winfield Scott's the old guy that's too fat to get on the horse. Then you got Douglas MacArthur, famous World War II general. Number three, Robert E. Lee. Now, first of all, guys, if you were to go get in your time machine and you go back to the Civil War and you said, "Hey, Robert," he'd probably keep walking. His friends just called him Bobby. Bobby Lee. Bobby Lee was out of Virginia. He's about 5'10". I'm going to tell you something. Lee looked like a general. Lee was compared to Washington as far as when he put his uniform on and he walked out into public, you knew that you were in the presence of a great person. Robert E. Lee is a great public speaker. Robert E. Lee has the ability, guys, to take any battlefield that he will fight at, three-dimensionalize it, and to know the weakest point and where to hit. Robert E. Lee would call councils of war, and he would bring all his generals like Stonewall Jackson, James Longstreet, and they would sit down. You kind of got to envision this, guys. They sit down at this table with their lanterns, and all of a sudden Robert E. Lee will envision how this battle will be fought. He'll say, "Look, George Meade's troops will come from this direction, or Grant, or fighting Joe Hooker, or whoever, and this is how it's going to be." Robert E. Lee's commanders loved him. Lee always rode a horse that was called, it was a Tennessee Walker, and they always knew the horse was named Traveler. When you saw Traveler, Robert E. Lee was there. Robert E. Lee is beloved by his soldiers. Robert E. Lee is truly a great military genius. Robert E. Lee was the most dangerous when he was backed into a corner. Now, the one thing Robert E. Lee has the ability to do, and if you're going to write a Robert E. Lee paper, you really need to talk about this. Robert E. Lee is one of the very few commanders in the history of warfare, guys, that can divide a force and conquer a greater force. He can divide that Confederate army, and he uses the Army of Northern Virginia like a weapon. The thing to remember about Robert E. Lee's army is they were a veteran army. When the American Civil War starts, the South does not have a 3-month period in which you're in and you're out. That happens with the North. The South will fight with the same guys. Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was a deadly group of people to meet. They had fought during this whole war. Most of them were country boys that came out of the South. They were sharpshooters. They were a deadly group. And the thing I always like to point out about Robert E. Lee is people say, "Well, he fought for the Confederacy." You know, if we could jump back in our time machine and go find old Bobby Lee, Robert E. Lee would tell you real fast. He fought for the state of Virginia. He was a Virginian first. Everything else fell below that. So Robert E. Lee's a brilliant commander, guys. But what was his trick? You know, we know that Robert E. Lee will lose at Gettysburg. And he loses big time at Gettysburg. He's going to fight a guy named George Meade. Now, the thing about Robert E. Lee that was very important, guys, Robert E. Lee knew every guy that he fought against. He knew every one of them. He knew fighting Joe Hooker. He knew Burns. He knew McClellan. He knew every one of these guys. And not only had he fought with him in the Mexican War, he had been at West Point. He knew what his opposition would do. I always tell my students, if you're a good chess player, you know, the guy may beat you on the first game, but you may beat him on the second because you learn his moves. That was the trick to Robert E. Lee. So let's go back to Gettysburg. What happened at Gettysburg? He's going to fight a guy named George Meade. Now, George Meade's a colorful character. His men referred to him as a goggled-eyed snapping turtle. And if you see a picture of him, he looks like a snapping turtle. These big old eyes. His horse was called Old Baldy. So you got a goggled-eyed snapping turtle riding on a horse called Old Baldy. Thing about Meade was an engineer. But what makes the Battle of Gettysburg different, guys? Number one, Robert E. Lee liked to fight in places that he knew. He did not pick Gettysburg. Gettysburg is just where his armies convey at, and all of a sudden, for 3 days, the army of George Meade in the Union and then the army of Robert E. Lee with Longstreet will meet at Gettysburg, and Robert E. Lee will lose big time. Has a heart attack. Actually, will ask Jefferson Davis for his resignation. Why did he meet? Why was he defeated by Meade? He didn't know Meade that well. He didn't know Meade that well. Now think about that just a second. Who's he going to end up fighting at the end of this war? He's going to fight old Sam Grant, which he does not know anything about Grant. So he doesn't. What I'm trying to tell you guys, Robert E. Lee does a lot better with the guys that he knows. If he has fought with them before, he knows his opponents. Now, the thing to always remember about Robert E. Lee, and my students will point out, and it's always a good point, they say, look, Mr. Hoffer, if Robert E. Lee had all the resources of the North, if he had everything that Grant had, then it would have made it fair. Good point, guys. Robert E. Lee is fighting off of minimum resources. Robert E. Lee's army is ragged. They're half starved to death. They don't have resources. Robert E. Lee is fighting off the bare minimum with the Army of Northern Virginia. But yet, time and time, guys, Robert E. Lee will defeat Union generals time and time and time again. When Grant takes over that army, the one thing Grant gets really tired of is every time Grant tells his generals, we're fixing to fight Robert E. Lee, their deal is, you don't understand. They called Lee the Gray Fox. You don't understand, Sam. You don't understand this guy. Grant quickly figured out all these generals were scared of Robert E. Lee, and rightfully so. Robert E. Lee had basically put their butt in a bag every time he had fought them, with the exception of Gettysburg. So Robert E. Lee is a very good general. Now, he was a Jomanian, which is important to remember. A Jomanian was, they had rules. Joseph Jomani, or Antonio Jomanian, was a soldier that fought under Napoleon that wrote up rules, and these rules were what they were taught in West Point. And Robert E. Lee will be a Jomanian. He will follow these rules, and you will find out when we talk about Grant. Grant's not the rule follower. By the way, Robert E. Lee graduated second in his class, and he is a highly, highly intelligent person. Robert E. Lee, if he was taking my class right now, he would have a 98.9. He'd have an A if he didn't have a 100. Robert E. Lee was smart. He was extremely smart. He knew his opponents. He was extremely aggressive. And remember, guys, Robert E. Lee was the most dangerous when you cornered him. When you cornered that army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee could take that army, he could turn it into a weapon, and he would send that weapon against you. And time, that weapon, an army of Northern Virginia, it's devastated Union troops. Guys, many times, Robert E. Lee's troops would be outnumbered 1 to 3, 1 to 4, 1 to 5. There would be massive more Union troops, but yet he, under his leadership, he would take that army and he would attack that Union. He would divide those forces, and time again, he would win. Until he meets a guy out of Ohio, cigar smoking guy. He's about 5'7". His name is Grant. Grant's going to be, he's definitely going to be an awkward opponent for Robert E. Lee. I've told you everything that you need to write on Robert E. Lee when you write that paper, if you choose Robert E. Lee. I get a lot of people choose him. He's a brilliant commander. But I like to point out one thing about Robert E. Lee, guys. You realize in West Point today, if you were a cadet and you went to West Point, you would study Robert E. Lee as a historical figure because you're a military cadet. You would not study any of his military tactics. Why? Because Robert E. Lee will not be your modern American general. He had good tactics for his time, but the guy that he is going to fight, he is going to be a different cat of a different color. And when we follow this up, I'll introduce you to old Sam Grant. See you then.